All right, well, thanks for being with us today. It's an exciting Sunday. If you're just getting here, it's our 4th birthday, which is a lot of fun. I hope you had a chance to grab some donuts downstairs, some Vice donuts. They've been great. But today we're going to do something a little bit different. So if this is your first week, it might feel a little bit different. We're going to kind of talk about where we've come from, where we hope to go, and really why we do what we do. But I think this is a great week for you if you're new, and here's why. If you're new and there's stuff about this church that you have really appreciated, I think this week we'll answer the question, why? Why? If there have been things about this church that you have not appreciated, I think this week could answer the question, why? Or if maybe there has just been some neutral confusion about certain things that we do, this week could answer the question, why? And if you're a regular here and you've been with us for a while, this is an important time to kind of refocus on our why. The question is, why all things community church? Why do we do what we do? And we figured our birthday was a good time to kind of press pause and really hone in on that whole idea. So I want to start out with something that might seem totally unrelated, all right? Anybody here like to tell stories or hear stories? A couple of us, yeah, good. Like read books, movies, whatever. You know what's interesting? The human mind, it's almost like we were wired to hear stories. It's amazing if you think about it. Like if you were to hear content for 2 hours straight, and it was a speech or somebody reading, some kind of manuscript, it'd be really difficult to hear or to remember, rather. But it's amazing how you can sit through a movie for 2 hours or sit through a story and come right out and almost rattle off what the story was about, just like that. It's like we were wired to remember stories. But there's another aspect of stories that is pretty cool. Stories have the ability to clarify things that are unclear, right? Stories have the ability to bring familiar emotions to unfamiliar experiences. And not just stories, but stories in the form of metaphors or similes, right? So think about it like this. Imagine I'm trying to explain to you how to buy golf clubs, right? Now, I don't really know how to buy golf clubs because I don't buy golf clubs, but I figured we talked enough about basketball, so let's move on to something else. Like with golf, there's a process to get clubs. You don't just pick it out. You don't just order. You kind of got to go and get a feel for it. You got to make sure things are the right length. There's a whole process. Now, you can try to explain that process if you're trying to tell someone what it's like to purchase golf clubs. Or you could say, it's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? You gotta find the one that's just right. And all of a sudden, you've taken familiar emotions and you've applied it to an unfamiliar experience. Now, someone you're explaining to is like, okay, for the most part, I get it. Or maybe you don't do golf clubs. All right, how about a dress, right? Have you ever purchased a dress? I've never purchased a dress, but I imagine it's the same thing. You gotta find the one that's just right. And so you could say it's kind of like, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You got to find the right one. Or if you're trying to explain to a child the consequences of lying, not being totally truthful, you could go into it and how trust kind of erodes over time. Or you can say, it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf, right? And all of a sudden it's like, familiar emotions applied to an unfamiliar experience has the ability to provide an incredible amount of clarity, right? Well, not surprisingly, Jesus was an extremely effective teacher, and he used stories to apply familiar emotions to unfamiliar experiences or familiar feelings to unfamiliar facts. He was trying to teach people about what God was like and what life looks like and feels like when you're living with God as the king. And people like us have all sorts of different ideas about what it's supposed to be like and what it's supposed to feel like, what the motives is supposed to be, how it's supposed to hit emotionally, right? And so he uses stories to kind of get people to understand what it feels like, what it should feel like. And in Matthew's gospel, a biography about Jesus recorded by Matthew, Jesus tells this story, and here's what he says. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, hold on, before I tell you what it says. The kingdom of heaven, when I read this, I think, okay, that's a place, right? It's a where. But actually, it's not a where, it's a what. Jesus is using this phrase as like an umbrella term for what it looks like when you live with God as king, or what it looks like. We could even overgeneralize it and say what it looks like to practice your faith. He used the term the kingdom of heaven. He used the term the kingdom of God. In essence, he's saying, when you follow me, this is what it's like. It's this huge umbrella term for like religious life. We could say being actively engaged in your faith or in the church or following Jesus. However you want to put it, it's this overgeneralized umbrella term, right? And so he says, here's what it's like. Here's what it should feel like. Now, I don't know too much about most of you, but I'm willing to bet you could fill in the blank with something you've experienced. Right? Maybe if you sat down and got your creative juices flowing, you could think of something like, all right, when I think of God and trying to live for God, there are some feelings, and my feelings are like this, right? You've probably got an experience that you can match those emotions up with. For me, for a large part of my life, I would say the kingdom of God, like trying to do all this, it's like paying dues. It's like paying taxes. You know, there's some power I've got to like pay my dues to, so hopefully they never come to get me. Right? Maybe you'd say that. Or maybe you'd say, oh, this whole thing, this whole like practicing your faith thing, it's like believing in fairy tales. Or maybe you'd say it's like outdated. It's like listening to cassette tapes. Or maybe you'd say it's like living under an oppressive ruler who's just trying to stop you from having fun and limit your joy and make sure you don't cross the line. It's like living under the gavel of a judge who's just waiting for you to step out of place. Like maybe you've got a version of what this actually feels like to you. For me, for most of my life, it was largely negative. Then there was a season that kind of shifted to like kind of neutral, you know? It's like if I was feeling really creative, I could say, like for me, it could have been like the kingdom of God is like trail mix, you know? Like for the most part, I don't want it, but every once in a while, you get an M&M. And maybe that's where you are. Like, okay, there are some little things that I kind of like about this, but for the most part, I'd rather it not be there. So what Jesus is explaining here is, okay, if you're accepting what I'm offering, here's emotionally what it should feel like. And here's what he says. You ready? He says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. This is just the start of the story. So there's treasure hidden in a field. He says, now a man finds it. When a man found it, he hid it again, and in his joy went and sold all he had to buy that field. Now there's a few things, like we have to be careful here and understand this in the cultural context, right? Back then, they didn't have banks like we have banks. And so it wasn't super easy to store your wealth. And so it was pretty common for people to take their valuables and put them in the ground in a place, and they wouldn't tell anyone where it was because that would defeat the whole purpose. It would no longer be secure. Well, if all the people who knew about that thing died, then it really would be buried treasure and sometimes could stay there for generations. And so what Jesus is explaining is something that everyone would have known is a possibility. Like, it doesn't happen all the time, but people know it does happen sometimes. And the ethical thing to do would not be like, oh, sweet treasure, and run. What this guy does is actually the ethical thing. He puts it back and he says, okay, let me figure out what I need to do to go buy that field so that I can ethically acquire this whole thing here. The point of this story, okay, don't miss this. The point of this story is not that it's going to cost you everything, that you have to sell everything you have. What Jesus is trying to point out here is that this guy has stumbled upon something priceless, and he's willing to do anything and everything he can in his joy to acquire that thing. It's like, get it out of the way. If I've got to sell everything I have, nothing else matters compared to this. And so the people that are listening to Jesus here are hearing a story about something that happened to someone that was universally desirable. Everyone listening there would be like, I've like dreamed that was gonna happen to me or someone that I love. It's a universally desirable experience, and Jesus is like, that feeling, you know that feeling you're feeling right now? You're like, I want that. Like, that's what all of this is supposed to feel like. And so the question then is, do those emotions match your experience with God and the church? Like, is it something that is like universally desirable? Like, everybody wants it. Something that's so valuable, like in your joy, it's like, get out of my way, I want some of that. Or maybe I get it, maybe you're like, I'm not totally sure if this is true, if this is real. Like, is there even a God? I'm not sure. Fine, let's say there's not a God, okay? Let's just say there's not. No, you're not supposed to say that in church, but let's say there's not, right? Do you understand this message that Jesus came to offer the world as something that is too good to be true? Like something I wish could happen to me, but I just can't wrap my head around it. Most people I know, and if your story is like my story, that's not how I understood it. In fact, deep down, like while I really didn't articulate this at the time, I was hoping at some point I was gonna meet someone who's way smarter than I am that was gonna come along and tell me, guess what, none of it's real, you don't have to worry about it, you're off the hook. Because for me, it was this obligation, this thing like I gotta do just in case, not something I found attractive. And if that's your experience, you're not alone. I would say it's the majority of people, especially in this part of the country. Somewhere along the way, the like goodness and joy of what Jesus came to offer the world got lost. You know, before we started this church, we went around and just asked people to describe God or the church or their experience in one word. We tried not to be annoying, but it's kind of hard to not be annoying when you're approaching strangers. But we just asked them, we're like, hey, just in a word, like how would you describe your experience with God or the church? And the responses we got were universally negative, like completely negative, except for one. There's one guy who's like neutral. He was like, well, it's helpful. I'm like, okay, that's not positive. The rest were judgmental, hypocritical, money hungry, impractical, exclusive, just for church people, self-righteous. Like just a world of negativity. And yet Jesus is like, if you're buying into what I'm offering, it's supposed to feel like you've stumbled upon something priceless that could change your life forever. That's what this story is about. And so, really, that issue, like whether or not God is good, is at the heart of why we started this church. At that point in my life, what I would have said when I was struggling to believe, I would say I'm not sure if God is real. But honestly, what the belief was I'm not sure if he's good, and so I wasn't sure if I wanted him to be real. And that's a very commonly held belief. And so the idea that really got this whole thing going was, what if we started a church simply to change the way people think about God? Like maybe we don't even focus so much on whether people believe in God, and we focus on what they believe about God. And maybe if the picture became a little bit like clearer, there would be a desire to believe in God. And so then the question was, all right, well, if this is what we're trying to accomplish, right? And you can back this up with all sorts of Bible verses in spiritual language. We could talk about giving God glory in everything we do, right? Helping people to see him clearly. But in regular language, we're trying to take what people understand about God and change it, like show them how good he really is. And so the question is, well, what does that look like then? And for us, it looked like, and ideally will continue to look like, a church for people who don't go to church. We call this the vision because it's what it looks like. Like in everything that we do, we're thinking about people who don't go to church. This informs how we verbalize what we value. It's why if you've been here for a little while, you've probably heard us say, you can belong before you believe. Like you can call this your church home and not buy into everything we believe. You have permission to be in progress. It's another thing we say. Like you can take steps. And we get this from Jesus because the people that followed him for 3 years, the people that followed Jesus himself, didn't get it for 3 years. But things started to get a little clearer along the way, and they take one step after the next. And so we want to give people permission to take those steps. We're all taking those steps. Permission to be in progress. And what that means then is that there's no pretending. Like you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. You don't have to pretend to say it's all okay when it's not. You don't have to pretend to say you believe it when you don't. What if we designed a church that allowed people to come as they are, where they are, because that's how Jesus met people. And what would that look like? And so we think like real practically. You know, like one thing we do here, you might have caught on to this, we give coffee out for free. And it helps people stay awake during the service, ideally. But it also, like very practically, if you're new to church, if you're not a person who goes to church and you go to church and everyone stands up and starts singing, and that's not something you're used to, it's nice to have something to do with your hands. Really. And so what that means is we also have carpet tiles because people spill coffee. It's why we have such tight security in our kids' area. Because maybe if you've been in church for a really long time and you trust everybody that's there, you're totally comfortable with leaving your child with someone you've known for the last decade. But if you're coming in for the first time, you want to know there's like real security. And so we say in our kids programs, we not only want to be safe, we want to look safe. It's why your number is checked when you go to pick up your child. It's all of it we do with the person who doesn't go to church in mind, all of it. And so the question then naturally is, well, what if I go to church, right? And the answer is you're in this. Like you're right there in the first word. When we say church, we don't mean a place. We mean a group of people who believe what Jesus said, who are for a group of people that aren't quite there yet. Like people who are for people who don't go to church. And so if there's somebody in your life that you have been begging to join you to come to church because you want them to believe what you believe. You want them to experience what you've experienced. You want them to see what you've seen. We want you to feel like I can bring them and know we'll be waiting for them and ready. And they'll be spoken to in a way that they can understand. And they'll feel like this is a place that they can belong. And we believe this is the way Jesus approached people. He explained it in pretty simple terms. He's like, look, you got 100 sheep and 99 of them are all good, but then one is not there. You leave the 99 and you go for the one. There's this idea of prioritizing it. And this isn't new to us. There's a guy named William Tyndale who's one of the first people to translate the Bible like hundreds of years ago. He said, the church is the only institution that exists for people outside of it. And so the great thing is, like, if you start, like maybe at first you're like, no, this isn't for me, but then you come and like, oh, okay, maybe it is. And then things start to make sense. You start to believe a little bit and you're like, okay, I think this is my church. Well, then immediately we're now directed back outward. Like immediately we're for people who aren't here. Like once you get it, we start to give it. And you don't have to be a spiritual expert. You don't need to know all the things we believe. But the idea, and this is how it worked with followers of Jesus, is that they came across something they found to be priceless and life-changing, and so they invited others in. And so the idea is like, what if we tried to do this? And so about 5 years ago, we did. We tried to get the ball rolling, and some of you, I know, were there for this. We just said, what if we tried to change the way people think about God? Try to start a church for people who don't go to church. And from there, it's been unbelievable. It's like we tried to get the ball rolling and the ball started rolling on its own. Since that point, we've seen God do great things through regular people. Great people, but regular people. We were like the kids on the playground that were like, hey, let's build a fort. And everyone came out of the woodwork to build it. The people up front here often get too much credit for what's happening. But you know, if you were here and you had an experience with someone who's hanging out in the rain for 3 hours so that you parking your car can be a pleasant experience, there are so many people that God is using to create this community that's for people who don't go to church. And it's been amazing. Right off the bat, when we first explained this to the church that we were at on the North Shore, right off the bat, 2 people that we were friends with came to us. They invited us over for dinner. And they said, we're going to sell our house and move to Babylon to start this church. And this was before we had moved. And so Allie and I looked at each other like, okay, we're doing this, right? Like, I guess this is actually a thing now we have to do. And it was amazing to see how people jumped on board so quickly. We knew like music was going to be a big part of this because music connects with people in really powerful ways. And so we wanted to have like a strong music program, but we're not strong musically. And so some of you know this story. We started praying for God to bring us people because music people hang out with music people, you know, but we're not music people, so we don't know music people. And so we're like just hoping God is going to bring us someone that's going to build a music program. And I knew of Tom Pryor, but we weren't friends. And I had one experience with him several years ago. I asked him for help, and he said he had to go to the movies. But Allie and I started praying for him. And during that season, we went to a conference in Pennsylvania. And I went to the bathroom at this conference right before it started. And at the urinal next to me was Tom Pryor. And I looked over at him. You don't do that. And then we had a brief conversation. But then I went into the auditorium, I found my seat, and he was sitting directly behind me. And it started to feel like God was doing something special through a lot of different people. There was a woman who told me she was praying that God would give us a building in Babylon on Main Street. I was like, you keep praying that prayer. And that's really what happened. It's an incredible story for another time, but we were given this property. And then when we got ready to launch, we were gonna meet in another location because this place wasn't in the condition we wanted it to be downstairs. And we had to move out of that place. We found out we were gonna be in the Freemason Lodge. We found out we couldn't be over there. And so we moved over here 2 weeks before we were about to launch and just told the team we've got to transform what downstairs looks like. And people came together, and through what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, this incredible team was formed. And when we launched the church, and then COVID happened, and we closed down for 52 weeks, and there were moments where we were like, I don't know if we're gonna make it out of this. And then we relaunched again up here because volunteers came out of the woodwork and transformed this room. And somehow we relaunched after COVID in a stronger place than we went into it with. It's been unbelievable. We've had people like literally make crazy donations to allow us to fix the roof and redo the property. Like this is what it is because God has been doing amazing things through people. So here's my question for you. 2. If you're someone who's like, I'm not sure about this, I don't know, church is not for me. Like there's a community here that is thinking about you, preparing for you, and has made this church for you so that you can come and ask your questions and be real and not have to pretend. And maybe then you find out it's not for you, and if that's you, that's okay. But this has been set up for you. And so what if this is the year you see for yourself? You take steps in that direction and come with your questions, your doubts, your hang-ups, your struggles, and be real and say, this is why. Maybe you'll stumble upon something priceless. See the joy that brings and the potential it has to change lives. But you have to see for yourself. Or maybe you've been here for a little while. And maybe for you, like what if this is the year that Community Church is no longer a them, but it's now an us? What if you get on board with this idea? And maybe start bringing in people that you know and love and want to see what you've seen. Invite them in. Maybe you join the team and find a place where you can serve. There are people doing all sorts of little things, like people giving what they have. Last year, my daughter was adjusting the bottles on the table downstairs because that's what she could do. Maybe you join a group. Maybe you start praying for the church. Maybe you start to give financially. I mean, if you know us, if you've been here for a little while, you know we don't talk much about money because people in this area feel like the church is just out to get your money. So we don't talk about it because we don't want that to get in the way of what we're trying to communicate. But what that means is that there are people in the background that are generously giving so that this church could be what it is. So what does it look like for you to take a step toward building a church for people who don't go to church, if that's what you want to do? I heard a quote a couple of years ago. She said that most people who believe don't question whether or not God can do great things. They question whether or not God is willing to do great things through them. That's a hard thing to believe, that God is willing to use you. It's a hard thing for me to believe that God is willing to use me, because I know me and all my issues better than anyone else. And you know you and all your issues better than anyone else. But what if God wants to use you to do great things? I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but I want to leave you with this story. About a week or two ago, I sent out an email. Some of you might have gotten it, where I just said, hey, I'd love to hear your story. If this community has made an impact on you, I'd love to hear about it. And some of you wrote some really cool things. It was a lot of fun to get to read through those. But I want to share one of them with you. Here's what she wrote. She said, before I attended a service at Community, I was absolutely someone who said church is not for me. She said, I've paid my dues and I wasn't interested in paying more. I still can't figure out an explanation of how it happened or why it happened, but somehow I found myself sitting in a service on a Sunday. During the service, Lou had said something along the lines of, even if you don't believe there really is a God, I want you to try something this week. Just once, talk to him and ask him to show you himself and all the goodness that he brings. She says that week was an internal battle. On one hand, I wanted to ask and just, see. On the other hand, I didn't want to get my hopes up, because what really could happen? Well, I decided to see. So on my own, super uncomfortable, not even knowing how to pray, I tried, and I asked God to show himself to me. Well, he did that. My boyfriend and I would attend church together when we were available, when it was convenient. Then that turned into us watching it during the week if we missed that weekend, which then turned into me going alone if he couldn't make it. Sundays quickly became our favorite day of the week. It was insane. She says, I was broken and felt so alone at times, and yet Sundays were helping to heal my wounds one at a time. Fast forward, and exactly a year after attending my first service, I got baptized with my boyfriend. It was incredible. The people we had become in just 1 year was absolutely insane. Our relationship was saved because we learned how to have a relationship with God. I'm changing and healing from the inside out. I know that life will still play its course, and at times it's going to be really challenging and even heartbreaking, but I have peace because I know my life is in the hands of someone else, and he knows far better than I do. Then she closes with this. She says, I'm only here for a short amount of time in the grand scheme of things. But while I'm here, I get to experience life so great, so high, so loving, so abundant. She says, every day I remind myself that I undeservingly asked God that one time to show me how good he really is. And he absolutely did. It's as if she stumbled upon something priceless, and her life will never be the same. If you have a kid who has received a card in the mail after going to one of our kids' programs, she wrote it. If you've driven by the sign that's now hung in front of our building, she hung it with her company. And she's doing other things that people can't see. And my point is, now God is doing great things through her. And so that's why. That's why Community Church. That's why we're a church for people who don't go to church.